Hi, my name is Sean Mancheri. This is part of my engineering ethics final presentation. We'll be discussing nuclear energy, the nuclear option. So nuclear energy, introduction. So nuclear energy only produces around 10% of the world's energy. In America, nuclear power amounts to 20% of our energy. The reason for these small numbers are a combination of factors, mainly a fear of nuclear power from the public, and this is due to also another variety of reasons, but mainly because of the past disasters and what it's been used for before. The other reason for these small numbers is the cost to develop and maintain nuclear energy power plants. There have been three major disasters related to nuclear power: 3 Mile Island in the US, and Chernobyl in Ukraine, formerly USSR, and Fukushima in Japan. So this is the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. This is like the Richter scale, or in earthquakes. This is used to measure how severe a nuclear disaster or incident is. As you can see, from 7 to 4, it is called an accident, nuclear accident. From major accident to accident with local consequences, accident with wider consequences. And from 4 below, it is an incident, serious incident, anomaly, and deviation. So the three disasters. The 3 Mile Island, which happened in the US, there's a map of it on the screen. It is caused by human factors that led to a partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor. This is rated at level 5. As you can see before, it is an accident with wider consequences. Chernobyl is rated at 7, and this is the largest nuclear disaster in history. Human factors coupled with poor building of the plant and some disregard for international safety measures resulted in nuclear fallout expected to last thousands of years before its effects are no longer seen. It's rated at level 7 on the INES scale. Fukushima is the latest of these nuclear disasters. It is also rated at level 7. It's not in the same. It's not really equivalent to Chernobyl, but it is significant because of the full meltdown of the reactors. It wasn't really impacted by human error. It was mainly a natural disaster that caused the full meltdown. So it is still important because now we can learn from this disaster. And for this presentation, I'll be only talking about the first two, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. So a brief history of nuclear energy. In 1955, we see the first nuclear submarine. It is USS Nautilus. And obviously, 1947 is when we see the first real reuse of nuclear power, and it's used, unfortunately, to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is also probably the first time that we see nuclear power comes into the public eye. And as the 1950s rolled around, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the two big players in the world at the time, started investing heavily in nuclear power to build up their arms, but also invest in their energy sources, because nuclear power turns out to be really very powerful. The USS Enterprise, launched in 1960, is also the first nuclear aircraft carrier. So the Chernobyl disaster, what went wrong? This was a safety test, really, that went awfully wrong. The test involved lowering the entire electrical supply of the reactor for a test to see what the reactor would do, or how we could limit any problems, really, with the reactor if the electrical power was suddenly gone, or an outage. Unfortunately, instead of going halfway, it suddenly went all the way to zero. So it was supposed to run around 700 watts, and it fell to 30 megawatts. 700 megawatts, it fell to 30 megawatts. Thermal energy. The engineers attempted to return the reactor to half the power, but it did not reach the mark. To get there, they turned off the emergency cooling power and this was turned off for around 11 hours up to the disaster. So the International Nuclear Safety Group, which was formed around immediately after the disaster to evaluate what happened with Chernobyl, they deemed this action to be indicative of an absence of safety culture. Continued. This created instability in the reactor's core, the power outage, plus turning off the emergency cooling system. So this led to an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. The reaction superheated the water meant to cool the reactor and produced a massive steam explosion. The INSAG, which is the other group I mentioned, also determined that parts of the actual design of the reactor was also faulty and added to the reason why the reactor meltdown occurred. And this is because metals that they used, or lack of the metals that they used, to channel some of the fallout and direct it towards another place or a safer place. They did not add these things to the reactor design, so it actually in turn made the disaster even greater than it should have been. They also disregarded safety protocols in terms of they did not build a containment vessel that would have limited the exposure of radiation to the surrounding areas. So altogether, it was a real misstep on the USSR and the engineers who built this facility. So it took the USSR 2 full days before the world knew about this disaster, a real lack of transparency in the USSR. And it was only when Sweden, a nearby country, detected nuclear fallout, and that's when they realized that something wrong had gone on in Chernobyl. And even then, it took the USSR state-run media 3 days before they would tell their own population that something had gone wrong in Chernobyl. A real transparency error and a really immoral decision. So right after the disaster happened, the USSR built a temporary concrete surrounding covering to cover the radiation from going even further than it had, just to protect any more radiation that might be there. So this is a map of the place. You can see it's right next to Belarus. Almost 70% of the nuclear fallout landed in Belarus, which is north of Chernobyl. The WHO Cancer Research Arm has estimated that close to 9,000 people will have died due to Chernobyl-related cancer. To date, about 6,000 thyroid cancer cases have also been detected among children who were near the disaster. But thankfully, only around 15 people have died by 2005 was the latest count. In 1997, the European Union and the G7 countries, G7 is the top 7 economies in the world, they agreed to pool their resources to build a better covering for the Chernobyl disaster reactors, and they spent close to $2.25 billion to build it. This would be steel and concrete mix. So now we go to 3 Mile Island. So in 3 Mile Island, this was a partial meltdown of the 3 Mile Island Reactor 2. And this is a accumulation of pump failures, improperly closed valves, which led to the steam generator not working. So the steam generator is responsible for removing heat from the nuclear reactor. Removing heat avoids damage to the reactor. So the steam generator shut down due to some faulty machinery, and the reactor shut down. The reactor's supposed to shut down. That's the good thing. The relief valve, which is on top of the on top of the reactor, was also opened. This is supposed to be part of the standard safety procedure. However, the instruments that was supposed to say the relief valve is open was malfunctioning, just like the other instruments, and it was bouncing from on off. So the operators in the control room were all really confused as to what the actual situation was. All they could see was that the pressure was precipitously dropping in the reactor. So what they did was, to counteract that, was they turned off the emergency cooling system. So this led to the operators turning off reactor cooling pumps that cooled the reactor core. So all these actions led to the reactor to overheat. The heat caused the cylinders in which the uranium fuel cells to melt. And over half the uranium pellets melted in the reactor. And that melting reacted with the substance already in the reactor to create hydrogen gas. The hydrogen gas built up into a bubble of sorts. Thankfully, the bubble did not explode or catch on fire due to the lack of oxygen in the reactor. So the aftermath. Right after the disaster happened, the governor had to set a 5-mile radius exclusion zone, and it was a voluntary exclusion zone. You don't have to go, but almost 500,000 people were now faced with the decision whether to stay and wait it out or to pick up their stuff and go, which is a pretty big decision to do. And everyone is frightened to death because they don't know what's going to happen. There's not really much. They don't really know what's happened for sure. So according to the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, around 2 million people surrounding the incident have received an average radiation dose of only about 1 millirem above the usual background dose. So you put this in perspective, really. An X-ray is around 6 millirem. The natural background radiation in the area was around 100 millirem to 125 millirem per year, though. So this is above average 1 millirem. Which is not too bad. It's actually it's just above average, and it cost over $1 billion to clean up this mess. So there's the disaster and the money situation all combined. It increased fear levels of nuclear energy, increased the regulation in nuclear energy, which costs money to do all those things. Which is why the energy in nuclear energy is only 20% in America. So with respect to utilitarianism, the issue in Chernobyl was a clear example of when engineers were too focused on completing the project rather than completing the project with the proper amount of safety features and protocols. The studies that followed the disaster showed that the builders of the plant had no plan for such a disaster and also did not meet the international standards of safety, as they cut much needed materials as shown by the INSAG report. I've mentioned the materials before. With respect to 3 Mile Island, the real threat here was human error and faulty tools. So in reality, the negative aspects of TMI could have been avoided. But we all know human error is something that we can't really predict, but we can mitigate against it because we know what went wrong here. We can learn from it, allow the US to make better regulations, make better training programs, which would limit the amount of human error and make better plant design. So my main point of nuclear energy being good for society will still stand. So totalitarianism. Nuclear power can be very helpful with dealing with climate change and might be the best replacement for fossil fuels. It is free of carbon emissions, can produce the same or even greater amount of energy as fossil fuels. Now, the negative aspects of nuclear power is that the impact on the environment, which will in turn affect the society. Nuclear waste can last thousands of years before the effects are gone. It will cost lots of money to develop new plants and maintain nuclear waste. In the US, nuclear power can reliably output at maximum capacity 93% of the time all year round, which is 1.5 to 2.5% more than fossil fuels and close to 3% more than solar and wind energy. This is with only 94 nuclear reactors in all of America. The nuclear power plants actually require less maintenance for the plant itself, such as refueling, which only needs to be done like every 1.5 to 2 years. Renewable plants are intermittent in the energy output, which I'm talking about is solar and wind energy. They're not year-round reliable with equivalent, so they can't produce the same amount of energy with the equivalent amount of plants to produce the same amount produced by one nuclear plant. What I'm saying is it would require nuclear power plants with one can produce the same amount of energy that 4 renewable plants could create. So this is the graph of energy capacity factor by energy source, meaning the reliability. So nuclear is at number one, 93.5% of the year it is reliable at maximum capacity. Natural gas is second, but even then it's like twice as high. And coal, hydropower, wind, solar. So all those other powers are not as reliable as nuclear power. Carbon emissions. This is the big topic nowadays. So developing countries combined with developing countries comprise the total carbon emissions. So as we know, carbon emissions raise global temperatures. And unfortunately, 1 out of 7 people do not have access to electricity. So basically, what I'm saying is developing countries are not willing to give up their newfound wealth, which came from giving more energy independence, energy to their people. So they're not going to give up their oil or fossil fuel factories. So the best way to convince them to go to more carbon-free power plant energy sources would be to convince them to go to nuclear power. This in turn would allow them to create the same amount of energy, while at the same time the world would benefit from having zero emissions, carbon-free energy source. Climate change. Rising CO2 emissions is directly linked to creating greenhouse gases around the world. Greenhouse gases then in turn increase global temperatures. Right now, many countries have been focused on lowering their CO2 productions. CO2 emissions in 2014 were 35.7 billion tons, including 10.5 gigatons from China, 5.3 gigatons from USA, 3.4 gigatons from the EU, and 2.3 gigatons from India. So nuclear energy is the clear frontrunner that can allow us to have the same amount of energy consumption while drastically cutting down on CO2 emissions, because nuclear power is, as I said, a carbon-free energy source. So nuclear waste. Nuclear waste can last thousands of years to hundreds of thousands of years, as such long-lasting storage containers are needed. And everyone knows this. But the problem is it costs money to develop these things, and develop it and build it. So far, waste has been stored in steel barrels or in concrete structures like in Chernobyl. Further development will still be needed. But so far, these solutions have not had any adverse effects. So what I'm saying is the solutions that we've had so far aren't actually bad. It's just we could get better at it. We could do better and find new solutions too. So there are facilities being raided right now to help with the storage, to store massive amounts of nuclear waste for thousands of years, like one in Norway. There's this one called Nakalu, I forgot the pronunciation, but it's being created to last around 100,000 years. And that's also they're also trying to combat future societies that might come into contact with the nuclear waste facility. They're trying to avoid that by digging it in unknown places in anonymous places that no one else can know about. And they're also digging warning signs. It's fascinating. They're building a lot of warning signs into it that could translate to future societies who might not even speak a human language. So there's that. And that all is because of development and of the technology and finding newer ways to store the waste. So in the future of nuclear energy. So in general, there will be better reactors. Over time, there will be more development and more money spent to develop nuclear reactors. For instance, in 2020 itself, 824 million was spent on nuclear research and development this year alone. So this thing is ongoing. So we'll see better reactors and ways to store the energy, store the waste. Thorium reactors. This is a new technology it's a new form of reactor fuel, like uranium. Just going to list the benefits here. Thorium is more abundant than uranium, and it can only be used as a material for energy purposes, meaning that it can't be used for nuclear weapons, which is a huge benefit for which is a huge thing for developing countries, as we've been worried that these developing countries might arm themselves and might create more tensions, global tensions. So, reason why thorium it can be used for nuclear weapons is that it needs a partner to breed with, to create energy, to create that nuclear fission. And it needs plutonium, actually, recycled plutonium. And that can't be used to make a nuclear weapon either. Fusion. So this is basically the next step for nuclear energy. It's what goes on in the sun. There's a lot of development going on right now. There's this thing called the ITER reactor in France. It's got a lot of governments pooling their money together to create a fusion reactor. It's the largest one in the world. So this is where we could see nuclear energy end up. And fusion is a really great energy source. It's completely clean and efficient, and it has no really adverse effects. It doesn't even have nuclear waste that I know of. And so that could be really revolutionary in our energy consumption. And so if we go down this path of nuclear energy, we could see developments like this. So conclusion, the facts of the case that I've presented, nuclear energy is a good thing for society as a whole. The benefits of nuclear energy are worth the risk. From combating climate change to satisfying our energy needs, nuclear checks every box. We still have to worry about safety concerns, but we can't ignore the benefits of nuclear energy. So we have to take into account both of those aspects and build better regulation, more safety features, and better training protocols so that we can have a better energy source while at the same time limiting the human errors that could create problems, and also combating the natural disasters that could have effects on the nuclear power plants, like in Fukushima. We're excited. All right, thank you.